Alliance with terrorists, terror, war on terror. Terrorists are as guilty as the terrorists themselves. September the 11th. We cannot wait for the final September the 11th. Of September the 11th. September the 11th. Of September the 11th. Of September the 11th. Of September the 11th.
Some people paid $25,000 to have their pictures taken with the president today inside the Hilton. Back outside, we do want to mention that earlier today during the demonstrations, 5 people were arrested.
Emerge from the morass of mainstream mediocrity and misinformation. Rise up now and tune into Mad as Hell TV.
Welcome to Mad as Hell TV. Today we're going to delve into the subject of civil disobedience and its role in the peace movement with my guests and my co-host right now, Clyde Lewis of Ground Zero, Shahid Ahmed, producer and host of KBOO Radio and Portland Cable Access, Dr. Dinah Hartzell, a professor of human sciences in the Human Sciences Department at Marylhurst College, Marianne Hall, a participant in Critical Mass, and Jim Lockhart, a producer and an activist at Portland Cable Access. Welcome. Okay, so right now there seems to be a lot of controversy about why, there's a lot of questions asked, why are people in the peace movement still protesting when the war is basically over? I'm going to read one quote just to get us started here on possibly the reason why, and then we'll discuss how we protest. To announce, this quote is from Theodore Roosevelt. To announce that there must be no criticism of the president or that we are to stand by the president right or wrong is not only unpatriotic and servile, but is morally treasonable to the American public. So I think that kind of goes a little bit into explaining why we're still protesting, but let's talk about how. So let's start with you, Dinah, and talk to us about a little bit about the scholarly approach or the historical approach to civil disobedience.
Well, scholarly or historical immediately, but I've been thinking very much about the blocking of the bridges that went on the night the war started. And I've been really quite puzzled by it, although I haven't had much opportunity to talk to people who actually participated and what their motives were, so I'm sorry that I haven't had that experience. But I've thought about bridges and thinking about the symbolism of bridges and sort of been thinking, well, maybe blocking bridges isn't the best possible idea in terms of thinking about what the statements are that people want to make when they commit a civil disobedience. Bridges to me are connectors, and so when we're trying to make connections or trying to understand things or trying to argue against war, which is a great separator, I'd really like to see people think about bridges really quite hard and maybe come up with another way of maybe even glorifying the bridges rather than blocking them. Although, again, I'd love to hear some other people's ideas about blocking them.
Marianne, were you there that night when they blocked the...
I was in and out of the bridge blocking, but I was on 405 with the bicycles that were blocking traffic too, so it's kind of like a bridge. My thoughts were that the bridges are mostly occupied by cars, and it's a public space that is beautiful that's never used. So it wasn't like it was not being used. There were people there that were enjoying it. And it's also one of the few ways to get attention of the American public is to block traffic. So.
Okay, and you're a part of Critical Mass. Why don't you tell people a little bit about what that's all about?
Critical mass is a little bit hard to define because it's not any one group of people. Anyone can show up. You show up and on your bicycle, and you don't know where you're going. You don't know who's going to show up. You just know the time and place. So anything that can happen. Some people look at it as a fun community bike ride. Other people look at it as protesting car culture. There are just a lot of different reasons that people ride, some maybe for social reasons. It doesn't seem so much like a fun community bike ride because you're usually accompanied by more police officers than there are riders. It's not untypical. At the same time, you are maybe meeting people you know there and enjoying the quiet of not having cars right beside you. You're somewhat insulated from car traffic if there's like 100 or more riders, and it's very quiet and peaceful experience.
And so, what part did the critical mass play in the latest peace protests?
Critical mass has been out at quite a few of the protests, and every Friday we've been meeting and writing, though we usually only meet once a month. We meet by Powell's Technical Books in the North Park blocks on Fridays at 6 o'clock. Well, the part that we played was that we were, some people were riding because they were wanting to protest the war by saying no. Obviously, if you're riding a bike, you're not using oil, so no oil for war. Our part was we ended up on 405, and at the same time, it wasn't planned, but at the same time, the other freeways and bridges were blocked, so there was a lot of traffic that was stopped. The city was shut, so to speak, shut down. If you consider people being able to move in their cars, the only type of activity that goes on in a city. So.
Okay, and the reasoning there was to make people aware of what was happening and the killing and so forth in Iraq.
Well, there was, that would kind of be my reasoning, but I can't really speak for the group
well,
at
that's
all.
fine for you to speak for yourself.
Yeah, okay.
You know.
Speaking for myself, yeah, it felt like no one has paid attention to any of the other types of protests we've done, so now we're going to slow things down downtown and voice our opinion. So.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts about that, Jim?
Well, I think that philosophically speaking of it, in our society, he who speaks the loudest is usually the one heard. And in our society, money talks. And our congressmen and congresspersons, I guess I should say, who they hear and who they pay attention to is the ones with the money. And so if folks have a message and folks have a desire that they want to get across to their delegation or across to through the media, they can't be padding the wallets of Congress and to get their will known. So and the little things that they can do that are within the law really are inconsequential. You can't. They don't get any attention. So at that point, you have to go to civil disobedience. And the civil disobedience means that there's different kinds, but I'm speaking of peaceful civil disobedience, where you sit down and you try to cause problems and stop the flow of society in order to make your point. And at that point, then you start having the different ways, whether you should block this or the bridges are a problem with some people. And I was at a federal building downtown that the veterans were coming to get their checks and they couldn't get their checks. So no matter what you do, you're going to cause problems, and there's going to be people that are going to be upset with what you do. And that, I think, it's more than the philosophy of civil disobedience is the actual strategies that people employ are what is causing problems. And no matter what you do, you're going to upset somebody, and that since you are going to be in a situation where you're going to upset somebody, the media, who are a part of that money class, it seems like, at least in my opinion, they will use whatever problems you cause to marginalize your efforts. And so,
especially if there's any kind of, they call it violence, though I hesitate to use the word violence when you're breaking property. It seems like there's vandalism. When there's vandalism involved, that's where the cameras are. I mean, I must have seen the picture where windows were broken, I don't know how many times on TV. Just the same thing at the WTO. So, but you know that going in, that's what they're going to focus on.
Sure. There's different levels of peaceful protest and nonviolent. I mean, some people would say breaking of a few windows at Starbucks is within the parameters of nonviolence. Others say that it isn't. And there's an awful lot of dialogue, I'll use a good word here, within the activist community about what is good and what isn't.
Right. What do you think, Shahid? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think protest is as old as this country is itself. I mean, the Boston Tea Party, for example, but not only that, you can look at the women's suffrage movement, you can look at the veterans coming back from World War I and not getting the things that they were promised. Particularly myself, as an African American, I have a great deal of admiration for the protesters because they are out there. They are exercising and doing the kinds of things that's going to cause attention to what's going on. I remember during the days of the civil rights movement, it was always, well, go slow. Well, you're not, you're disrupting, you're hurting your cause. And in terms of the violence, we should look at the violence that police use on sometimes innocent protesters or people who are trying to disagree with the government. And I think, I was, like a lot of people talk about the anarchist, and I was feeling pretty much the same way. Well, you shouldn't be breaking windows and so forth. And I heard them interview one guy, and he sort of kind of made me think, particularly after Mayor Katz and others would say, well, this protest is costing money. This protest is, you really need to stop. But one thing that they said that really made me feel good as an African American and as a Muslim. He said, hey, we don't want you to feel comfortable. Here, you worrying about somebody stopping traffic, you worrying about somebody breaking a glass, and you got people being murdered. Yeah, we're going to make you feel uncomfortable. And, when he said that, it made me stop and think, maybe, they are the true Americans. Those that are willing to get out there and put their lives on the line to make a statement about the direction this country is going. So, as many of us who would say, well, we should tone it down, and I'm going home and eat a TV dinner and watch it on television or something and watch a TV show. I'm not sure that is really in the American tradition of protest. So.
Okay, Clyde.
There is a fine line where, as a person who has studied history and a person who talks about this all the time, there's a fine line where we start saying to ourselves, when do we start becoming like them? Because we're always fighting the cause against them. What is the cause? The cause is trying to passively and through using the laws to our own benefit, making things work for us. Well, when do we start saying that being violent brings peace? That's what George Bush says. He says, we bring violence into the world, it will bring about peace. If you're a protester and you decide to be violent, you're hypocritical. And I have said on my show that as I was observing what the media was trying to portray the protesters as, it did hurt the protest cause. I was out there yelling from the rafters to stop the war. Once the war began, we then have to stop ourselves and say to ourselves, well, it started. Now we have to bring about the balance. It's important that we bring about the balance, because if we're still protesting a war that's already begun, we're basically shooting ourselves in the foot. So what we need to understand now is that the first gauntlet has been dropped, and that they will hang themselves, because we have been the peace people from the beginning. But the minute we start being violent, we're no different than George Bush. And I always say too that sure, the protests will bring about change, but they won't bring about peace. And that's because of the fact that you have a group of people, and it really bothers me when they say, well, maybe we should get violent. Well, this isn't the Boston Tea Party, okay? This isn't Kent State. We have grown as a nation since those times, and so they have gotten smarter since those times. So now we have to learn to outsmart them. And he was talking about money. It's important to note that it seems to hurt them more when their pocketbooks are hurting than when they're having their windows broken or spray paint or whatever. If it does stop them from making the money that they want to make, then they start saying, well, this is going to kill us. I was involved with a boycott one time for Thailand. It was the Don't Buy Thai boycott. And one of the things that I was against was the Asian selling of children for sex and opium trade. I found out that the Chinese triad was involved in putting money into the coffers of both the Democrats and the Republicans during the time of Clinton. And I thought for a minute, and I said to myself, boy, they're both evil, aren't they? Well, there's something that I need to do. I need to boycott, and it wasn't that big of a deal, but I wanted to boycott Thai goods. And I was called a bigot, I was called whatever, but you know what? The Thai sex trade now is at an all-time low, and children aren't being marketed by Southeast Asian drug lords, at least not as much as it was. And I even met with the Princess of Thailand and told her why I wanted this to happen. So sometimes if you continually try to get into people's faces, not in a violent way, but in a way where you use logic and you use the means of negotiations and diplomacy, sometimes you get into doors you wouldn't normally get into. And that goes for both sides of the fence. I was witnessing a talk show host in town walking in, pretending like he was some sort of a journalist, getting in the face of Mayor Katz, and Mayor Katz basically dismissed them. Nobody's going to want to talk to someone who's constantly in their face yelling at them. But if you talk with them and you're open-minded with them and you hear what they have to say, then you kind of find a good medium where you can say, well, you know, this is what it's going to bring you if we decide to boycott this. This is what it's going to bring you if we decide to sit in the park this day. This is what's going to happen. Then they have to think twice about the groups, rather than having the media say, well, these guys are breaking windows and destroying property. You know, that puts a bad light on everybody. And in fact, it puts you in the same realm as those who are out there killing in some regard. Because people don't differentiate. They just don't. It's not the way it goes.
Yeah, I myself have had a mental debate with this ever since I've heard about the different protests, and I'm on both sides of the fence because I kind of understand the impetus for it. I mean, I understand the feelings because we are, all of us, so outraged about, you know, you look at the people who are being killed, losing their whole families, losing their body parts. I mean, and to stop traffic for a couple hours, when you look at it in perspective, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal. On the other hand, I understand what Clyde's saying because I work in a place where everyone who came up to me said, those damn protesters, they stopped me from getting blah, blah, blah. And it was just an onslaught. I never heard one person say, oh, I understand their point of view. I
got something different. I had anger and I had fear. Now, if you're a protester and you're putting fear in the hearts of people who are American citizens getting about their business, you're making a big mistake. You don't want to have anybody fearful, because when people are fearful, they do stupid things.
And they're already fearful. So anything
fearful of protesters?
Well, they're just fearful. So anything that you throw out there that could maybe tweak on that existing fear, it's then all that amount of fear can go in the direction that you've tweaked them in. Mm-hmm. You know,
I think also though that a lot of the violence is provoked. You know,
yes.
that's something that we're not looking at. But I think
that's true too.
Generally too, though, I think it's naive to say to a large degree in this day of corporate America that, well, you know, if you make them mad, nobody's going to listen to you, or if you make them mad, you're going to make more enemies than if you don't make them mad. My wife and I really don't like the protest or the march, really. That's one reason why I became a Muslim. I didn't like the march, but I'm learning, and I have learned that it takes a lot of courage.
You became a Muslim so you didn't have to march?
Well, I wanted to be involved in the civil rights movement, but I wasn't into the sit on the luncheonette stools and let people pour milk on you and dogs biting me. I wasn't into that. Mm-hmm. Although I've learned since then that takes a lot of courage. But I just wanted to, you know, express my displeasure in another way. But the point I'm trying to make is, my wife and I, we was marching with this contingent coming over the Broadway Bridge, and this was a little while back. It was about another issue, but I think it had something to do with the war. But anyway, we were marching, and it must have been about 1,000 people. We marched across the bridge, and we had the kids had the drums and so forth. Went to Pioneer Square. I believe it was when Israel, I think it had something to do with Israel and Sharon when they went into the Palestinian territories, and it must have been about 1,000 to 2,000 people. We went down to Pioneer Square. They gave some beautiful speeches. All sorts of people across the political spectrum was there. The news didn't have one iota of what happened. Mm-hmm. Was a peaceful
unless there's violence,
they
is
won't.
Your point?
They totally did not cover it. When you look at companies like Clear Channel, who has 1,200 stations, if you're not going to, they don't want to get you on. And we both, and I think all of us have seen how the media has totally capitulated in terms of their responsibility, in terms of presenting objective news and so forth. I think they had a demonstration at CNN recently talking about that they're cheerleading. They're cheerleading. Mm-hmm. So then
for the war,
yeah, for the war. Yeah. They're cheerleading for the administration. We don't see the kind of objective reporting that many of us grew up seeing with like Walter Cronkite and others who take an objective view. I mean, they're just cheerleading while the rest of the world is getting real news.
Right,
so.
Which makes me nervous, doesn't it? You?
Yeah.
Everyone hates us. Not only does our government hate us,
everybody
but the
else
rest
does.
of the world
well,
hates
and the biggest criticism, like he's saying, the biggest criticism of all is the media and what they're doing. Mm-hmm. The media does tend to focus on those who are causing violence and trouble. I remember the WTO riots.
Right.
Perfect example of that. Exactly. I mean, someone dressed as a sea turtle is not going to go breaking windows. And they didn't focus on those dressed as sea turtles. They focused on those in the black Nikes going in and destroying Nike, which was
Exactly.
hypocritical in a sense. I mean, I think that from a standpoint of people who are involved with peaceful protests, or at least protests where they want to be seen in solidarity rather than seeing as violent groups, you need to somehow, I guess you could say, police yourselves in some regard. You know, you can police yourselves a lot better than having the guys in the black monkey suits doing it. And I think that I always thought of a great Onion headline, you know, protesters put on Kevlar and take shields and gas to go on against the police. I always was waiting for that to happen, but it won't. And it's like no one ever focuses on how the protesters have been organizing and how they're really well organized. I've seen dramatic speeches come out of protests. I've seen moving speeches come out of protests. I've seen people with great slogans on their signs coming out of protests where it makes you go, wow. I mean, every little bit helps. But the minute you start changing the minds of people to look at you in a sense that you're a militant of some kind, look what it did to the Equal Rights Amendment. There were women who were burning their bras and doing all kinds of crazy stuff back then, and a lot of women will not identify
That's true.
with those groups because of the silly and stupid things and the eccentric things that they did. So if you're gonna be a peace protester, you ought to think about how you're being perceived, because if you're doing the public good as well as getting them irritated in a little way, I mean, a little irritation doesn't hurt. I mean, I do that every day on my talk show.
Yeah, Clyde, you irritate people every day.
Of course, I irritate people on my talk show every day. But you know, sure, I've had attacks on me verbally and physically. But you know, I just look at it as at the end of it all, I can say, well, that was just something to get you to think. But you know, some people take it one step further and they get violent. And I have to be aware of that. But most of the time, I think that what I do when I try to provoke thought is that's exactly what I want to do, is provoke thought. And
So
I'm
what
not
you're
gonna get in
saying is
people's
good to
faces
be
over it.
clear on your objective.
Yes.
So if you're going to have civil disobedience, what is your objective?
What is your
Not
goal?
Just, are you lashing out, but you're lashing towards?
Well, you also want to just say, too, just want to remember, when you say being violent, they're not hurting people. They're hurting, or they're taking their frustration out on material
Property.
And
So
I'm
that's,
thinking you of
yeah.
a few, like the McDonald's and the McDonald's window being smashed. There was a Starbucks where they put acid, some kind of acid on the window, and then there was the steel bridge where they kept showing footage on the news of a group of protesters in the front with a banner that they were pushing into the police. And those were the only three things that I know of that could have possibly been perceived of as property damage, which is, in my opinion, not violence.
No, it's not violent, but I interviewed one of the leaders of the Animal Liberation Front. I had him in my basement. He was a terrorist. They called him a terrorist. I had him in my basement. I interviewed him. You know what he did? He bombed a McDonald's and killed a security guard by accident.
I'm just talking about right now, that wasn't a bomb.
But what I'm saying is that, you know, it's all fine and dandy that we can destroy property, but when somebody's in the crosshairs and they get hit accidentally, that's when you start getting labeled.
All I'm saying is that in the recent protest here, there were 3 fairly minor incidents where I don't think anyone was hurt, but that was really played up in the news here. And the incident on the steel bridge, that wasn't where people were arrested. There was one person arrested on the steel bridge.
Well, if it's going to be played up in the news, then why do you do it?
But we didn't, I mean, I didn't personally take part in any
But
of those
I know,
3
but what I'm saying
activities.
is, if it's going to be played up if you know that it's going to be played up in the news that way, why do it?
Why protest at all?
No. Why do something that will be perceived in the news as an act of terrorism when you could do something that's a little bit more productive?
Oh.
You
Well,
know, what
to
you're
get on
doing
the
with
news.
critical mass is not terrorism. What you're doing is you're doing something that you believe in that's supposed to help people be aware of cars and how cars are polluting the world. That's a
Right.
good thing, okay? There's some good things to that. But when you start doing something that's perceived as violent, and you say, well, it's just a material thing, it doesn't matter. Well, material things cost money. You never know who might lose a job over it. You don't know, the aftermath we don't think about. We don't think about the aftermath. When we go and we bomb countries, we don't think about the aftermath of uranium-tipped bombs and how kids are born with defects later. They don't think about that when they do that. So we have to think of our objective and our goals when we're protesting. What is the ultimate goal? Are you going to bring awareness to people, or are you going to piss people off? And if that's what you're setting out to do, to piss people off, and that's just it, then you're going to have people pissed off at you, and then you're going to have to deal with that too.
Well, let's take the civil rights movement for a minute. How far would the civil rights movement, I mean, you're going to have to piss off somebody. You know, I mean, you look at down south, Bull Connor was pissed off. You know, but who cares? I mean, to some degree. So, I mean, like, I'm sort of like, on Courtney's side in the sense of you're kind of like on both sides of this issue. If you don't piss them off, then you're not making some sort of statement. Look at Gandhi's march all the way through India. You know, I mean, it pissed the British government off, and then they reacted. So, you know, again, what's the purpose? Let's look at the purpose.
Yeah.
Let's look at what the objective is.
Because I think what, you know, in those instances, for instance, Gandhi always had a very clear purpose in mind, was to get Britain out of there.
Right.
From beginning to end, and he succeeded. Martin Luther King, his goal was, you know, equality, was civil rights. He refused to use violence. That's one of the reasons I truly admire him, is that no matter what, and that man was subjected to every kind of threat, every kind of violence, and in the end, the ultimate violence, and he never once gave in. I mean, how can any of us be like him? That's pretty hard.
They burned their clothing that was made in Britain.
So
Sure, it pissed the Britons off, but did it harm anyone else? No. And then when those soldiers opened fire on all those people, did he return with violence? That's almost like 9/11 happening again.
No,
he didn't.
Yeah.
And so his objective was to passively remind people. And that's what we need to find out.
Well, I'm not suggesting people go start getting guns and start shooting. I'm not suggesting that at all. You know, so I just want that, but I want to be real clear. But I think a case can be made for not having people being comfortable while, like he said, while bombs are dropping, while I mean, you have no water and no electricity in almost a whole country here, and the objective, you know, hasn't been, you know, achieved. I'm not even sure the objective is still the same as it was. So I'm not suggesting, and I think I just want to be real clear that we're not talking about, and I'm certainly not talking about people getting like the British did and get guns and all that kind of thing. But I think a case can be made for.
You know, speaking about objectives, most of the protesters that are down there, in my mind, I've been to quite a few of them. I've taped them for hours. It's a lot of just middle-class people, their kids, you know, older people. But there's two levels of participation in these that are outside that reasonable, and that is just the people that are going down there because there's action, and they're, you know, we want to call them hooligans, whatever. They're just down there to have a good time and to create trouble. And then there's, you know, there's possibly people like what Courtney mentioned earlier, people, saboteurs, who are down there deliberately trying to give the folks a bad name. And so if it's, you know, really clear that there's a bunch of us out there and we want to make this point, yeah, that's fine, but there's also these other fringe things going on and we have no control over.
Do you know, during the civil rights movement, the FBI, I don't know if people remember programs like the COINTELPRO.
Oh, yes.
Right? Where they sent provocateurs
Right.
into these demonstrations to give this kind of impression. You know, can we say that that's not happening
Early
now?
labor movement.
we
They
can.
did.
Yeah, the labor movement. Okay, so again, it's to generate kinds of discussions like, oh, well, why don't you go around and look, or you are alienated those who are for your cause. Mayor Katz just recently came out saying, you know, it's costing the city a lot of money so that we can divide and conquer. So now we can put a wedge between the protesters and those who genuinely oppose the war. We can put a wedge between those and get more people to go for, just like you say, well, support the troops. You know, no, everyone supports the troops. We just opposes the war.
There should be media watchdogs at protests with bullhorns. And every time they see a reporter talking to somebody who's broken a window, get a bullhorn and go, it's not having anything to do with us, get out of the way, and just disrupt the whole thing. That won't go on TV. It just won't.
They didn't talk to people who broke those windows. I mean, they just showed the broken window over and over. I never, if they did, that person would be in
Well,
jail.
what you do is you have signs that say, we have nothing to do with this. You get
There's
aggressive with
thousands
them.
of people and like 2 or 3 that are doing this.
Then are we
maybe
organized? We've got to be organized with that kind of
you
stuff.
can't like pull in out
You
of
can't?
thousands and thousands of people. You can't control every action by every person.
Right. But what
I mean, you can try to patrol.
No, what I'm trying to say is
Yeah.
that there should be people within every protest. I mean, you guys organize, and you're very well organized. There should be people within the protest groups that know
There
that
were,
if they disrupt television communication, it'll change the attitude of what the media is perceiving. They are controlling us. We're not controlling them. We should have control of the media. We should know that the media will go in and they'll make you look like a total ass.
yeah.
They will do it. Trust me, I'm in the media. okay? They'll go in and they'll make you look like a total ass. So what you do is you make them look like asses too by saying, you know, you get a bullhorn and just yell at them. We have nothing to do with this, or this is all a big joke. This is all a big show. They're making us look bad, and it's nothing to do with us.
And I think you should hire Clyde for that part because
I would do it in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
I would love to.
Well, there were people from indie media doing something similar to that, I think. And then there were also, I mean, there are people that patrol. There were people called peacekeepers. I don't really understand exactly what their role was, but a friend of mine was doing peacekeeping during one of the bigger marches. I mean, there are people doing that, and within your group, I mean, you can, if there's like somebody you see hitting a car, you can say, please don't do that. Maybe you shouldn't do that, but you can't, like, if somebody has the intention to like go break a window, they're probably not going to do that in the middle of the protest. I suspect that was done like later or before, or like off to the side of the protest, or on some other, you know.
Well, you need to look out for each other. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah,
the
I think people
protesters need to
do.
look out for each other
Yeah.
and realize that the protests are for the idea that we are passively trying to get the message across. And we see some idiot ruining our party, we ruin their party. We ruin their party of making us look bad. I don't want to look bad for anybody. If I'm going to go do something and somebody's going to make me look bad, I'll make damn good and sure that I make them look twice as bad. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with going in and saying, hey, you're the media, you got a camera in my face, I'm going to make damn good and sure that my point is being made.
I heard though, like internationally, like from people that I know, like in other countries, that it was portrayed more positively.
By their local media?
By their local, I don't know if it's local media, but just like in my friend in London, like she heard about it, that Portland was closed down for an anti-war protest. And here it was a different story because there was more, I don't know, visuals or more manipulation. But I mean, you have to kind of think about a broader perspective maybe too than right here.
I mean, if I was at a protest, chances are I'm working or something silly like that, but if I was at a protest, I would like to get a bullhorn. If somebody threw a tear gas bomb at me, I go, ladies and gentlemen, George Bush says that he doesn't gas his own people, you know, and just let them know that, you know, this is all hypocritical.
just get his number, call him up.
Yeah. Well, you should go because there are people doing that. I mean, there are people doing that, but I mean, I saw people for jaywalking thrown to the ground, you know, like
Okay.
different
Let's
topic.
we're going to take a break here because we are going to switch topics and go on to that police action. So stay tuned and we'll be right back.
Good, you're doing great. I'm going to do it one more time. Okay.
We're going to go back to Dinah right now, and you're going to talk to us about strategies for civil disobedience. So give us your thoughts.
So I've been listening to everybody and I've been thinking, okay, great, we've got all these great tactics and thinking, and there's several things that I think we're missing in the conversation. And I think the word consideration, which is actually a translation of a word that Confucius used way back, is critical, and it's one of the things that historically has been critical to civil disobedience. You didn't see Henry David Thoreau just reacting. You didn't see Gandhi just reacting, nor did you see Martin Luther King just reacting to things. These are people who pondered long and deeply the things that mattered to them and to the people that they spoke for, or in Thoreau's case, what is the government? What does it serve? How is it supposed to work? And in Gandhi's case, who are these people of India that I'm trying to represent? And Gandhi felt he could never actually truly represent the people of India because he wasn't out in the fields in the hot sun working every day, and neither were all the other people who were supposedly representing India. For me, it seems very important to consider both things. It's important to consider the population of this country, which is itself besieged at this point in time with all the loss of social services and so forth and so on. And do people who are arguing against making a civil disobedience to disagree with the loss of services and the difficulties that the U.S. is inflicting on Iraq, Afghanistan, et cetera, do people want to also inflict difficulties on our own people? This is something I think that it's very important to consider. And I think also, for example, the things that Gandhi would come up with, we had this discussion about whether or not to provoke. I believe, and I think you can find quotes in Gandhi that he says directly, yes, indeed, we are provoking. At the same time, there was the whole philosophy of ahimsa, there was the whole satyagraha movement that worked very hard to have a depth. Gandhi worried very often whether the people who tried to practice satyagraha were ready for an action or not. This is something we haven't really talked about or considered. I think even, I don't know, I haven't heard a lot about it in Portland or around the country, that people would consider what kind of action do we really want to do, and are we ready for it? Are we ready to take the consequences? This is one of the things about satyagraha that Gandhi, and I think Martin Luther King did very much also, was to say, when we commit a civil disobedience, we're committing it in the full agreement to take all the consequences. The worst, Gandhi would go to the British court and say, lay it on me, I did it. I did these things, and I fully expect your complete retaliation or whatever the consequences might be for my actions. And I think we sit around a lot and complain about the police, and we complain about this and that happening. And sure, you know, of course, there are places in which the police are misbehaving. That's not to be argued. But I think it's to be expected in some sense. I think as a person who's committing a civil disobedience, in a way, one has to know that it is a provocation. It is a provocation. It's saying there's an unjustness, whether it be an unjust law or some other injustice, that I protest, and by my action of non-consent, in other words, I either create a provocative act, which I hope somebody will notice, or which I hope will draw upon me consequences that will then be seen, or I simply refuse to do the thing that I'm asked to do, pay taxes, to support the war, for example. And so it's this kind of really deep consideration that I find extremely important at this moment. I think a lot of us are running around going, there's a war going on, I disagree with it. Everybody agrees or disagrees with somebody, but have you really thought about what's really wrong? What are the things that are really wrong? And what are the things that I am willing to suffer consequences for in order to take some action? What are the actions I'm willing to take and suffer their consequences?
Yeah, that's a very good point, because most of the time, especially in my forums, a lot of the people who are protesters and people who are against the war, they see this on television where a protester gets into trouble, and they whine about it. And I write back and I say, you don't think that these people take into consideration they're going to have consequences come upon them for what they've done? And you know, if you don't want this type of behavior, then stay away from that type of provocation. You know, I provoke every day on my radio show. And some of the consequences I face, which I did face, I was a national talk show host. I did something very provocative about Timothy McVeigh, and I got pulled off the air out of several markets, and I lost my radio show. That was the consequence I had to pay. I didn't see it come after me, but then, you know, it was good to know that I was able to get on another radio station immediately afterwards. But I could safely say, well, they tried to keep me quiet, but you can't stop me. I'm going to keep going. And that's another thing. That's the new movie Horns and Halos that's out right now. You take a look at that movie and what you know, J.H. Hatfield did, and how he revealed in his books about, you know, President Bush and things of that nature. And then you start seeing him beginning to deteriorate, and then you see the consequence of what happens to him after he put out the book Fortunate Son. And you say to yourself, what a sad story, but you know, it's the consequence that he paid. How far are you willing to go, and what consequence are you willing to pay? Are you willing to lay down your life? Are you willing to, you know, get sprayed by a police officer? Are you willing to get beaten up? You know?
And it's good to be aware of the possibilities of, for example, misbehavior of the police. We know to expect that now. People know that those things will happen.
No, sure.
So commit an act that you're willing to suffer the consequences of. The other issue is the one that we've been discussing earlier about the media and what they cover. You know, well, of course, they're looking for the, you know, the violence or the, you know, something that's really going to show up, you know, and catch people's attention. So rather than complain about what the media covers, how about the consideration of what could catch people's attention? So symbolism, I mean, the fact that the terrorists hit the World Trade towers is incredibly symbolic. And it was on 911, and who knows whether they intended that or not, but certainly 911 had a lot of symbolism for people in the United States. So there's some consideration, whether that was considered or not, but this is the kind of thing that consideration can draw. So for example, when Gandhi saw that one of the heaviest problems with British rule had to do with salt, you know, he actually went home to his own hometown and sat and thought, what is it, what is the action that I can do? What is the action that I can do that will say what I need to say, that will make a difference? And he realized, I'm going to just simply make salt. It was against the law, against the British law, for Indian people to make salt.
Well, we could grow hemp here. I think that.
Yeah.
We could. What if?
We would. The repercussions for that
Well,
though would
but
be
then
prison. I think.
Well, and so was salt for a lot
Right.
of people.
Well, I think if you
Yeah.
if you look at it in a historical perspective, as you're doing, I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that protests grow, they evolve, and right now we're on the beginning. I think in the beginning stages of just frustration, beginning stages of dissatisfaction. Martin Luther King, he started with a bus boycott at first. It grew into a national movement. As you mentioned with Gandhi, he started with just seeing basic human rights violations on his people by the British, and then evolved into a strategy. So I think, and one of the things I try to tell my listeners, and whenever I do media, is that at some point we're going to have to organize, and organization will come to where we have this wonderful thing in this country called the ballot box, and we're going to have to organize and take back our government, because while we were sleeping, the media took just took control of the people and took control of the ideas of the people. While we were sleeping, the hanging Chad turned out to be what was valuable. So we're going to have to just again get politically active, and I think we're in the elementary stages of that. But I think that will hopefully be a necessary outgrowth to some of the things that we're dissatisfied about, because we do have the power in this country, and it's beautiful, the power to change government saying no. Vietnam demonstrated that. Vietnam took the protest from the streets into the ballot box, and we had people like Gene McCarthy come forward. We haven't had any politician who's been courageous enough, like you were saying about considerate enough to speak out against the war. But I'm sure hopefully that will come when they begin to see, and if they can see some true numbers of the people who are dissatisfied and not listen to what the media tell us, that 80% of the country is for this war. Mm-hmm. And so I think that we have to keep that in mind, that we're in an evolutionary, it's going to be an evolutionary process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would like to mention there is one candidate running, Dennis Kucinich, who has been very outspoken against the war and has proposed a Department of Peace.
Running for what, Courtney?
President.
Oh, wow.
Unfortunately, he's running. Well, I shouldn't say unfortunately. That shows my bias. Zip. He's running for the Democratic Party right now, but regardless of that, he is a candidate who speaks very articulately and very outspokenly about peace. So we do have, but the thing with I just want to divert a little bit on the ballot box thing. We've already shown the ballot box is corrupted a little bit. So I'm not sure that all of us have that much faith in the ballot box anymore. I mean, it's a good idea. We'd like to think that.
We still have to show up.
We have to show up, but we have to reform it at the same time, because right now money, as we were talking about earlier, money is really the motivating factor in politics.
But if you don't have that, then you're really going to have violence. Mm-hmm. Because protest is just a way to express your dissatisfaction. If you take that away, it's going to, protest is in the human being's nature, I believe. And if we're not protesting in a nonviolent way, I'm going to do what I need to do to get attention, to register my complaint. So hopefully, I like to think that we still can organize, grassroots organize, and move people and change our way of government, because we do have that in the Constitution. wonderful lady brought a copy of the Constitution. I'm sure it's in there someplace. That we still have that. We still have that right. You know, to change the government. In fact, we are obligated to do that according to the Constitution.
You know, and before we go off, I think it'd be really a good idea to think a little bit about the difference between civil disobedience and peaceful protest. Because peaceful protest is not a disobedience. That's within our rights.
Right,
As
exactly.
Just obeying
citizens
the
of
law,
this
you're
country.
saying.
If you
Freedom
have
of
a permit.
expression.
With,
Yeah.
well, with a
Yeah, that's
permit.
right. You should have to have a permit.
That
That's
can
true.
be also argued for sure, but I think it's very important for those who are considering civil disobedience to consider also those who are not prepared to commit a civil disobedience. It seems to me that there are people with young children. There are people I met yesterday down at Terry Shrunk, a grandmother, who is not willing to commit a civil disobedience because she is the sole caretaker for her grandchild when her son is working. She's responsible for that child. She's not going to put herself in a position where she would be hurt or sent to jail. And that's a respectable position. And I think it's also extremely important that that the avenue of peaceful protest be available to all people, because that's the huge masses of people. And I think it behooves everyone who is wanting to commit civil disobedience, which I respect deeply, to also respect the possibility of peaceful protest for those who are not ready, able, willing, whatever, to participate in a civil disobedience. I did see one thing at one march where a civil disobedience was staged off of a peaceful protest. And I would really call on people to think very carefully about that. When you stage a civil disobedience off of a peaceful protest, you put people who are not prepared for such a disobedience in jeopardy.
What about if you're in like the civil rights movement, for instance, when the local authorities forbid people to march, and if we did march, then we were committing civil
Then
disobedience.
that's a disobedience. That's
Yeah,
a different
that's
thing.
yeah.
If people
But it's
come
the
to a
same
peace
thing.
march believing that they are in a peaceful protest that's gotten all its permits
But
and
if they
everything,
won't let you march,
that's a
that's
different.
what I'm
That's a
talking
whole
about.
different situation.
There's also like, I mean, sometimes there's, with the police and people reacting the way they do, I'm just thinking of the when Bush came to town, that particular protest, and people were up at the front of the line. I don't know if it was permitted or not, but they wanted to move the line back. So they just started pepper spraying people, and that's when the child got sprayed in the face or whatever. But I mean, I think anytime you go out to a protest,
There's always a risk.
there's a risk, and the police are out there ready, usually in their riot gear, no matter what type of protest it is. So you have to keep that in mind, that there
Right.
could be some kind of provocation or not, because I saw people arrested for not getting across the crosswalk in time before the light turned red, and it was really unclear that you couldn't, since you're with a big group of people, that you shouldn't follow them across.
Right, and that's part of I mean, I think if everybody has to know that if you participate in a peace march, police presence will be there, and the police cannot be counted on to have perfect behavior. And then that becomes a situation, an unfortunate situation, a very unfortunate situation. What I meant to say was calling upon people who want to commit a civil disobedience to be considerate, so that they don't actually deliberately involve people who have not made that commitment.
Well, you
good
brought up the
point.
subject of
Yeah.
the police, so we're going to, right now, if the person on CG could put up the picture, there's a picture of a woman in Oakland who was hit by a rubber bullet. And all you have to do is hit the inscriber key there, and it should come up. And anyway, I think people should be aware, you're saying people should be aware of really what the police can and do during protests these days. And rubber bullets can be very dangerous and very harmful. And pepper spray, by the way, I think was outlawed for use in Iraq, by the soldiers in Iraq. And yet they're allowed to use it on peaceful protesters here. So that is something that, there's a local attorney here in town, his name is Alan Graff, and he's going to be, I think he's in the middle of a lawsuit against the Portland police for their deliberate spraying of peaceful protesters. So this is something, yes, that people should not only be aware, but I think they should take maybe take umbrage at that and say, wait a minute, we accept jail time, we accept prosecution, but we do not accept being abused.
Right, and those
You know,
are
with
those are-
non-lethal, supposedly non-lethal weapons.
Yeah.
And some of those, they're not non-lethal, they're less than lethal. Obviously, from that
Yes,
picture.
right, the picture did come up.
It
Good,
came
there it
out.
is,
Yeah.
right.
And
so you can
according
see
to
that.
Paul Richmond, who's a lawyer up in Seattle and who's been involved in this whole thing of the increasing militarization of the police,
Right.
those rubber bullets are supposed to be aimed low, not up high. You're not. There's rules that define how close you could be spraying people. And there was some protesters that had the pepper spray put onto swabs and put into the eyes, and it took 3 or 4 years. But the judges finally found that was cruel.
But
and
they haven't
Oh,
outlawed the use of
that
pepper
case
spray.
is still open, actually.
It's still being worked on, but the judge did find in favor that was cruel, and I'm sure it's going to be appealed and it's going to keep going.
Okay, because my friend told me that case, the guy never pursued it because he didn't have the time and money to do, or it could have been a different guy, but his friend got the.
Was this in the Redwoods down there?
Oh, I'm sorry. This was at WTO.
These are the
Same
forest
case.
protesters who
Sorry.
locked themselves
Yeah.
in the
In a
office.
congressman's room.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
So, but there are definite rules about how these weapons can be used, and they're going against their own rules in the way they're
Right.
using them.
So I think that's the issue. We can expect reprisals, but let's not expect to be tortured. You know, that's not really in the game plan.
You talk about rules of engagement. I think that's something the police should let people know, because people do
Right.
go to demonstrations thinking that they're going to be peaceful.
Right.
And like the person that took I think that same demonstration you talk about when the president came, and they had a child
Right,
who was
a
pepper
baby.
sprayed.
Right.
Yeah,
Right,
you know,
yeah.
and even the person said, "I wouldn't have brought my child if I know that this was going to happen."
Right.
But there should be a police which should tell people, well, if this happened, we're letting you know that we're going to pepper spray or we're going to do this, because it's beginning to look really more and more like a police state. I mean, when
Yes,
they close them bridges off, and I just happen to be coming from work, I mean, those troopers look very, very scary in
Yeah.
terms of some of the clothing they wear, and the face mask, and all of them was burly, and it was
And hundreds of them.
yeah, and it
Deliberately
was
intimidating.
yeah,
Yes.
deliberately intimidating,
Yeah,
and I thought it was overkill, to
Well,
say
another
the
word
least.
for intimidation is terrorize, right?
Yeah.
I'll never
Right.
forget
We
that
don't wanna use
first
that
May
word.
Day when my daughter was in the parade and I was walking alongside, and the riot gear came out, and I walked. There's actually a photograph. I walked over to this group of riot police who were I don't know what they were preparing to do, but I wanted to talk to them, and it was as if I was talking to someone who wasn't there, or a brick wall or something. There was nothing, and finally one of them stepped a little bit out of formation and pushed me, and that was the only interaction that I could get out of this person.
Well,
It's
when
amazing.
I was arrested, there were two different sites, but the women that I was in jail with, one of them was, everybody was pretty much arrested in the style where they throw you on the ground and then pull your arms behind you with the plastic handcuffs as tight as they can put them. And one girl was kicked in the face. One girl was pepper sprayed directly in the face. But there was just a lot of unnecessary, I mean, they were heavily armed and big men, and all, the women were smaller people that obviously weren't a threat to them. At the time they were saying things like, well, one of the protesters on the other bridge had jabbed the police officer with a screwdriver or something, and I mean, they were saying this is why they were being so brutal, but I saw it at other protests happening time and time again. People unnecessarily pulled off their bicycle by their hair, and just things like that are not really necessary with the population.
Those plastic wire cuffs, too, by the way, they are now releasing information that says that those cuffs create nerve damage in the wrists and in the hands. So people have walked away sometimes having it so tight on their hands that they can't have any feelings in their fingers. So
Yeah, it makes your hands go numb.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what we discovered was that on the left hand, it made that one go numb. The other one, you could wiggle your hand out of. So you had this weird situation. But yeah, I think I have probably a little nerve damage. But
So it does seem pretty daunting, our job here as peace lovers, to create a bridge with those who are trying to basically stop us from achieving our goal. thanks to the crew, thanks to all of you, thanks to my audience for joining us tonight on Mad as Hell TV. Right now you're going to see another clip from, and I'm going to get the name this time. Yes, Gabrielle and Thomas Chavez of Christ the Healer Peace Church organized this exorcism of the federal building in Portland. So stay tuned for that. And stay tuned next time, because Clyde and I will delve into the conspiratorial agendas of secret societies that are busy creating chaos to set the scene for the new world order. Thank you and good night.
God, deliver the executive branch and all of us from the spirit of greed in the name and power of Jesus Christ. We pray that this spirit may depart and that generosity may return. Amen. God, deliver the executive branch and all of us from the spirit of empire building in the name and power of Jesus Christ. We pray that this spirit may depart and that multilateralism may return.
We believe that we're in the lineage of Jesus, who cast the money changers out of the temple and who cleansed the churches in the book of Revelation from their distortions. So in that sense, it's an ancient thing, but it's very new that especially Protestant Christians would not be afraid to adopt this ancient, powerful form of prayer and apply it to social witness.
Right now, under the USA Patriot Act, when you check out a book from the library, the FBI can check and see what book that is. You can be taken from your home, held in secret, with no charges filed against you, as is happening right now to a citizen here in Portland. So now I'm going to give you an update on some resistance to the USA Patriot Act. Right now, at this moment, 85 cities have passed resolutions against the unconstitutional aspects of the USA Patriot Act. The latest is Mill Valley, California, but other cities include Eugene, Ashland, Grants Pass, San Francisco, Berkeley, Philadelphia, Chicago, Fairbanks, and Flagstaff. If you'd like to help get this resolution passed on the Portland City Council, contact the Bill of Rights Defense Committee here in Portland at the numbers listed on your screen. Because after all, the only thing that separates us from a totalitarian regime is the Bill of Rights.
I'm George W. Bush, leader of the free world. I want to bomb Iraq. And when the world says no, I say, yeah, whatever. Saddam has started to meet our demands. Yeah, whatever. I talked to Colin Powell. He said,
"Sir, maybe we should give the inspectors more time."
I said, no, you know why? Because this is my United States of whatever. Yeah. And this is my United States of whatever.
President Bush?
Hush up, don't talk to me now. And this is my United States of whatever. Leave it to me. Hello.
This is Putin. Russia will veto war.
I see. Whatever. Mr. President, North Korea's got nukes. Oh, ding dong dong ding ding dong dong. Translation? Whatever! I am Bin Laden. You still have not caught me. I'm George W. You know what the W stands for? Yet. Because this is my United States of whatever. Hi, and this is ding ding dong ding ding dong dong whatever. I hope you got the message. Good.
Liberation or hallucination? I'm Clyde Lewis. This is a Mad as Hell TV spin on No Spin News. Take a look at this picture. This is a picture that we have seen on every major network. It's a picture of the troops moving in to liberate Iraq. The statues have come down. Now, take a look at this picture. This is a picture of the special forces paid by our government to go in and liberate the Iraqis. Pay close attention to the man standing behind the man with white hair. Now take a look at this picture. This picture is a man that is claimed to be an Iraqi local who is cheering on the protests and the destruction of that major area in Baghdad. Now, take a look at this picture again of the statue coming down. Look at all the many people gathered around. You'd think there were thousands there. Many networks reported that there were thousands in attendance at this wonderful moment. Now, Take a look at this picture. Is it liberation or hallucination? I'm Clyde Lewis for Mad as Hell TV.